Croeso i'n cyflwyniad allweddol fel rhan o'n cynhadledd rhithiol i Curriculum i Gymru. Welcome to our keynote on the principles of curriculum design, which is part of our virtual Curriculum for Wales conference. My name's Kath Lewis and I am the Principal Improvement Partner for Curriculum, Cohesion and Assessment at Central South. Joining me today is Clarissa Brind.
And I'm the Strategic Lead for Curriculum Reform in CSE.
So what we're going to do today is look to further deepen knowledge and understanding of the requirements and the principles of curriculum design. So with that in mind, we'll get straight into it. Now then, you might have seen a slide that looks like this previously, this juggling person, and we do tend to always show this because it's another reminder of that full suite of reforms that we've got. There is a lot of change in the system, but of course wide-scale changes are needed to meet the national mission's aspiration for equity and excellence for all learners. It really is the enabling reforms that will wrap around curriculum to ensure it's enacted well with capacity and sustainability within schools in terms of high quality teaching and learning leadership. So in terms of those reforms, we've been part now of reforms for professional standards for teaching and leadership. We know that we've got our ALN bill and act. We've got the Schools as Learning Organisations framework, the national approach to professional learning. We've got our National Academy for Educational Leadership established. We've got major reforms to ITE provision and our work with HEIs in Wales. Of course, we've got the reform of our national curriculum framework, Curriculum for Wales, in addition then to an increased focus on school-to-school working. And then today we actually see the launch nationally of our framework for school improvement. So there is a lot of change, but we thought it was worth sharing with you this quote back in 2017 from our then Minister for Education, Kirsty Williams. And it is talking about that, the Welsh approach, considering every element of the education system. We can't possibly just change one element and hope for wide-scale transformational change. To achieve the transformational changes that are laid out in that national mission, it really is necessary to change all of those enabling systems, processes and policies to make sure that we can enact Curriculum for Wales in the way it's intended. So what we also try and do, I'm sure you've all seen Hub, you've been there, but actually on our travels, we still come across certain teachers who aren't sure about whether they need to log in to view the Curriculum for Wales guidance, which section they go to. So it's just to remind you that everything that we need in terms of reform is available on a Hub. So of course, there's the Curriculum for Wales, all of the guidance, all of the mandatory requirements, statutory obligations, they are all there. No login is required for that, so anybody is able to view that. Also, just to draw your attention, as I'm sure I've done previously, to the other section on Hub that you'd find really helpful. So that's the professional development section. So again, those enabling reform elements within there, such as the professional learning journey, information, the toolkit in terms of schools as learning organisations. You can access the professional standards, the national approach to professional learning. So there is so much to support leaders across all levels of the system within that section. And again, you don't need to be logged into Hub for any of these. Okay, so we're going to move on to look at the principles of curriculum design with you. But first, what we're going to say is that equity and excellence, as already laid out by the Minister back in 2017, is really at the centre of all of the reforms. The four purposes, the learner is right at that centre, but of course we have to ensure that these reforms are committed to that aspiration of achieving equity and excellence for all learners. So some of you may have already seen our Enabling Equity and Excellence document within Central South Consortium. So it's just to give you a reminder really about that document. So it aims to promote thought and discussion amongst the school community. It can really support you in considering, is your school curriculum, are your school systems and processes enabling that equity and excellence? So it asks pertinent questions about how equitable your organisation is, how effective it is in transforming policy into practice. It promotes and supports sustainable school improvement and learning leadership, so to help leaders make informed choices and decisions, again, around equity and excellence. It, of course, does recognise that all schools will be at different points of their improvement journey, but it supports with robust self-evaluation on the quality of provision and practices for inclusion and teaching. And I think that's so key for us when we're looking at the design principles we're going to take you through. It's not losing sight of that, of ensuring we are enabling equity and excellence for all learners across our system. So these are some overarching headlines to specific guidance and principles that are within the Curriculum for Wales framework on Hub. So you can see there, of course, those fulfilling the mandatory duties and the statutory obligations are really key, and then looking at each of those other overarching areas. So those are the mandatory elements. So if we are going to enable learners to make progress towards the purposes, if we're going to design curricula to be broad and balanced, if it's going to be suitable for learners of different ages and so on, then those things need to be key considerations for us and form key principles within our process of design. So I'll hand over to Clarissa to take you to where it all begins, the 4 purposes.
Thanks, Kath. Yeah, absolutely. The 4 purposes, as we know, are the shared vision and aspiration for every child and young person in Wales. And our school curriculum is everything a learner experiences in pursuit of these 4 purposes, and they should be the starting point for our curriculum design. And if we fulfil those 4 purposes, those high aspirations for all our learners, then we set those high expectations for all, and we promote individual and national well-being. Now, it's really important to consider that when we're designing and implementing our schools curriculum, we need to think about how we are enabling our learners to realise the 4 purposes and equip them for ongoing learning, work and life. So some questions really to consider here are, how does your curriculum support learners to realise the 4 purposes? And how are the 4 purposes driving your school's priorities, provision and practice? Now, also to consider, we need to look at the integral skills, because the 4 purposes are also underpinned by these. And at the heart of these skills is the importance of learners recognising, using and creating different types of value. So the integral skills are creativity and innovation. Learners should be given space to be curious and inquisitive and to generate many different ideas. Critical thinking and problem solving. Learners should be supported to ask those meaningful questions and to evaluate the information, evidence and situations in which they may find themselves. Personal effectiveness. This is very much thinking about the emotional intelligence and awareness that our learners need to develop, becoming confident and independent, something that is very much as well within the principles of progression. Planning and organising, where when developmentally appropriate, learners should be able to set their goals. They should be able to make decisions and monitor those results, take real ownership of their learning. They should also be able to reflect and adapt, as well as managing their own time, knowing where to go to seek for help, the people that they're working with, and the resources that they're accessing as well. Moving on, we're going to think then about broad and balanced. And the framework gives every school in Wales the opportunity to design their own curriculum that is broad and balanced, but within a national approach that ensures a level of consistency. Now, as schools, we're encouraged to build our own vision for our learners within the context of the 4 purposes, our starting point. It needs to provide the space for practitioners to be creative and to develop meaningful learning through a range of experiences and contexts that meets the needs of the learners in our school to ensure that it is broad and balanced. So a broad and balanced curriculum, to sum this up, should really provide a breadth of learning for all our learners, and it requires us as schools to make sense of the wide range of experiences, knowledge and skills that will be drawn upon across a range of contexts, topics and activities. We need to make sense of the links between the different areas of learning and experience and how learners are able to apply their learning to new situations and to increasingly complex issues. And we also need, very importantly, to consider to the extent to which we've made these links within our curriculum design and the enactment of our curriculum. Is there a gap between the intended curriculum, what has been designed, the implemented, what actually is happening in school in the classroom practice, and what is being attained as manifested by learners?
Thanks, Clarissa. Yeah, absolutely. And broad and balanced is one of those principles that comes up right throughout the guidance, doesn't it, on hub, and something we talk to schools a lot about, as does progression in learning. Progression in learning is that development and improvement of skills, knowledge and understanding over time. And so it's really important that the curricula that we design have got that understanding of progression, how it is that children and young people make progress in learning. Now, of course, it talks there about, making progress in a given area or discipline as learners increase the depth, the sophistication, but we always want to keep our curriculum broad and balanced. We're going to take you next to the principles of progression, because if progression in learning is the process of developing and improving in skills, knowledge and understanding over time, it is the principles of progression that underpin all of that.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Kath. And as you say, we've discussed this many times with lots of schools, and it's something that really should be, as the guidance says, at the heart of curriculum design. And when considering descriptions of learning or a specific context, topic or experience, the principles of progression help practitioners to understand how learners should progress with that deep, sophisticated understanding and depth of learning. And practitioners should recognise that learners will progress at different paces. And that's something now that we can really feel empowered with, recognising the different pace of progression for our learners. There are 5 principles that underpin progression across all areas. And the principles are increasing effectiveness, increasing breadth and depth of knowledge, deepening understanding of the ideas and disciplines within the areas, refinement and growing sophistication in the use and application of skills, and making connections and transferring learning into new contexts.
And I think that second bullet there is something we talk a lot to schools about making sure that we're not trying to shoehorn things, rather than starting with that theme and fitting learning to it. Let's look at these 5 principles. Let's discuss, let's understand what they mean. And if we're looking at the backwards design model, we're going to tie, and we're starting with the end in mind, we're looking at, so, if we are going to increase breadth and depth of knowledge in our curriculum, if we are going to increase learners' effectiveness, what are the best ways of us doing that? And we put those things into our design, as opposed to saying, well, we already do this particular topic, or we've got a cupboard full of these texts, so we'll try and fit these principles to that. So, sometimes there will be things that you've used previously that work really effectively, but it is, in terms of having the quality of the design process, it's really considering, what do these principles mean? What are they articulating? It's an aspiration here, isn't it, for our learners and young people, and then making sure the curriculum design, particularly then the content we select underneath that high level curriculum design, allows that progression to be there and to be strong and appropriate to individual learners' needs. Shared understanding of progression. I'm sure hopefully lots of you will be involved with regional and then national networks. There's some really exciting national work on developing this shared understanding of progression. And something we've noticed recently is that we talk about it all the time, but I'm not sure if we're always articulating what it means, the definition. Do we just assume that people know what we're talking about? So again, we went to the guidance, we take everything back to what does it say in the guidance, and so the practitioners collectively within your own cluster schools and with schools beyond the cluster. It's about exploring, discussing, and then understanding those three things. So joint expectations for learners and how they should progress. And of course, really importantly, then considering the knowledge, skills and experiences that could contribute to that progress in schools. And of course, that those things, that the selection of content must be drawn from looking at the statements of what matters, descriptions of learning, principles of progression. And then how to ensure coherent progression for learners throughout their learning journey, and in particular at points of transition. So for example, across and between primary and secondary school, or across and between settings and primary schools, or schools and EOTAS providers, or even just from year to year within a school. Are we having conversations around individual but group learner progress also? And then that brings us to comparing expectations for progression. We now don't have nationally prescribed levels or benchmarks or attainment targets. So it's about making sure that the expectations that we have within my cluster of schools is comparable to the expectations in a cluster of schools somewhere else within our country. And we get there by having these rich discussions, dialogue. We have discussions, we go away, we might realise we need to read a little bit more around that, the framework or another piece of the guidance. We go back for more discussions. So it really is so key that we understand that this shared understanding about progression is about talking with teachers within our own schools and beyond about what it means for learners to make progress against the national framework that we've got.
Thanks, Kath. It's really important to understand that there are clear expectations around progression. And as Kath said, we do need to have the professional dialogues, the professional conversations with practitioners within our schools, within the cluster and with other schools, because having the time and the space to develop that shared understanding is crucial, because that is one of the fundamental aspects of curriculum design. We need to be really clear that we have a clear understanding as well of our expectations within our school in terms of what progression may look like for our learners and the pace at which our learners progress. Now, the guidance says very, very clearly that we need to ensure that all of our learners are able to progress at an appropriate pace for them. The guidance says very clearly that the professional dialogue that should be within the clusters and within networks and schools, as Kath has been saying, really should feed into the collaboration to develop those shared approaches to the design of our curriculum. Having a shared understanding means that we will have a clearer expectation for how our learners should progress and how the knowledge, skills and experiences should contribute to this. And as Kath mentioned earlier, that will be drawing on the statements of what matters, descriptions of learning, and crucially, the principles of progression. We need to understand how progression should join up for learners across their learning journey, and in particular, those points of transition to ensure there's coherence that we've mentioned already. We also need to make sure that there is sufficient pace and challenge in our approach to progression. We need to make sure that we have time to evaluate, we have time to review the progress that our learners are making. And we also need to make sure that these are aligned to our assessment arrangements so that we are clearly identifying the ways in which our learners are making progress so that we know where our learners are in their learning and how we're going to move them on. This aids us very much into the next slide, where we're thinking about why this and why now. And within the process of curriculum design, we should be determining what knowledge, skills and experiences will support our learners to progress, both in the short term and over time, and how these are sequenced. Now, when we're considering the specific knowledge, skills and experiences as referenced there in the slide, we need to work collaboratively with other practitioners, as we've drawn out from the previous slides, within and outside of our cluster. because, as we've already mentioned, this is crucial to developing that shared understanding of progression. Now, there are key questions that we should be asking as we're thinking about learner progression. Why this? Why now? What are you building on? And how are you moving the learning forward? We need to be really mindful and clear of the purpose of the learning. We also really need to know our learners, the context that our learners are within, and understand their needs so that we're really clear about where they are in their learning, the support, the challenge that they need, and how we as teachers, practitioners are going to move them forward.
We're now heading a little bit closer to the minutiae of curriculum design. And so what we're going to do is delve into an area of learning experience, or to look now at some of the key things that we have to consider within curriculum design. And the next couple of slides are looking at those key considerations in terms of AOLE development, these pillars of learning. What we've got to try and do as curriculum designers is, of course, have the vertical coherence in terms of those AOLEs, and then we've got to really cleverly try and make sure that we're interweaving in a horizontal manner all of those cross-cutting themes, making sure the cross-curricular skills are there, making sure that we've got rich, authentic context for learning, making sure the local, national, international contexts are being drawn in. So there are a number of wider considerations, but if we're looking in, particularly in terms right now at the mandatory and the statutory, then we need to start with those statements of what matters, because as it says there, all of our curriculum content must link back to those statements of what matters.
So now we're thinking about descriptions of learning, and descriptions of learning, as it says there in the slide, they provide guidance on how learners should progress within each statement of what matters. And the statements of what matters, as we know, are mandatory, and all curriculum content, as Kath has just explained, must link back to the statements of what matters. And our descriptions of learning are those reference points. They are those planning tools that help us plan for learning and need to be really understood and unpicked so that the content selected provides both breadth and depth of learning. It's really clear to bring out, as in the slide there, that they are not designed as standalone tasks, activities, or assessment criteria. We shouldn't be assessing against them. We need to be using them as reference points, as explained. When we're thinking about breadth and depth, what are we meaning there? Well, with regards to breadth, we're saying that actually practitioners should use these descriptions to bring together a broad range of experiences, knowledge and skills. And we should be exploring those through a wide range of contexts, topics and activities, all selected very purposely, as we've mentioned earlier, in the process of curriculum design. And there should be real, relevant, purposeful links here across the areas of learning and experiences as appropriate. When we think about depth, we're talking about how learners are supported to engage with these descriptions of learning in increasing depth and sophistication over a period of time. Our learners are moving from novice to expert, and we need to make sure that we help our learners. We provide an increasingly challenging context and allow for diversity, reinforcement and reflection on their understanding. We need to remember as well that with descriptions of learning, they are designed to be considered through a range of different disciplinary lenses. And we as practitioners should think carefully about these disciplinary perspectives and incorporating them into their learning. It says very clearly in the guidance that as learners progress, they should have greater opportunity to specialise. And the disciplinary context for descriptions of learning should become increasingly apparent in curriculum design. It doesn't say when that needs to happen. And when we're thinking about child development and the holistic approaches that we need to consider for early years, we need to think about when the disciplines do become more explicit for our learners, as the essence of the learning becomes more specialised.
But in terms of that coherence piece, it's a really exciting area to look at, because we can look at, often in curriculum design, particularly with practitioners, they're going straight to those AOLEs because they're going naturally to the statements of what matters that are mandatory. But then what we've got to make sure that we do is look then at that horizontal coherence. So we've got our pillars, we've got our AOLEs, we know what knowledge, skills and experiences that we're going to be saying are really crucial to making progress within this particular concept in a particular statement of what matters, ensuring then that we are always doing that learning through AOLEs with consideration of everything else that needs to be interwoven throughout it. So making sure that we are aware of using appropriate context for learning that do consider religion, values and ethics, that we are considering relationships, sexuality, education right across. So the curriculum coherence is really exciting. It's about bringing together all of these moving parts of the curriculum to view it as a whole, because once we've done our curriculum design, we've brought these different principles into consideration, we've almost taken our curriculum apart and put it back together. Does that make sense coherently? Is it giving the holistic approach that we want? Is it contributing to our learners' well-being? Is it remaining broad and balanced? Is it going to be achieving those four purposes? So that's another key principle that you need to be aware of throughout the design process. Well, Clarissa, we can't have a session without talking about assessment, can we? That would be remiss of us. So I'll hand over to Clarissa just for the next part.
We definitely can't, and everybody who will know me knows how passionate I am about assessment and progression, so good slide for me to take on. As it says there in the slide, there are mandatory requirements, and we do have legalities and legal obligations with regards to assessment that do link with our principles of curriculum design. It says really clearly here, doesn't it? Schools must make appropriate assessment arrangements to support learner progression. We know that fundamentally assessment enables learner progression, and we need to be very clear about how we are assessing the progress made by our learners. How do we know the learners are making progress? How do we know that they're moving forward appropriately, they're making the correct pace, they're being challenged, supported appropriately? How are we identifying where our learners are and then identifying the next steps that they need to move themselves forward in their learning? It says there, doesn't it, the last point there, that assessment arrangements at a school or setting level are a matter for individual schools and settings to determine. So what is the purpose of assessment? What is the assessment informing us of? How are our learners involved in the assessment process? So moving on, we need to think about, why do we assess? And the Supporting Learner Progression Assessment Guidance is very, very clear. There are 3 key reasons to assess. That is to support individual learners on a day-to-day basis. It says that learning should be indistinguishable from teaching and learning. We also need to identify, capture and reflect on individual progress over time. And lastly, we need to understand group progress in order to reflect on practice that will also inform our school improvement. It says very clearly in the guidance that assessment strategies and approaches should be age appropriate. So we need to be very mindful of how we're using them and at what age we're using them and how we're expecting assessment strategies and processes to support learner progression and how we're using the information collected to move our learners forward. Now, the focus very much for assessment will be on identifying where the learner is, their next steps, and the support or challenge that is needed to move them forward. The descriptions of learning, as Kath has mentioned earlier, within Curriculum for Wales are not a replacement of the levels, the outcomes, and they are not, as we've mentioned, to be assessed against. It's very important that we understand them, we unpick them, we make sense of them, so that we are reflecting on what the knowledge, skills and experiences are within them to enable our learners to make progress. Now, we already may use a wide range of assessment processes and strategies within our school, but it clearly says in the guidance about the power and strength of observational assessment, and we should be using observational assessment to look for evidence of the learning that we're seeing with our learners, and to assess what the learner can do consistently and independently in a wide range of learning experiences, and drawing again on the importance of child development and understanding development to children is really crucial here.
Okay, that brings us to looking at assessment and accountability. We shouldn't really have those two words on the same page, on the same slide. Welsh Government at policy level have been really keen to do all they can to decouple those two aspects. So it really is just key to say that, reiterate to you that the information that is gathered through any of those methods and means that Clarissa was talking about then are only used by practitioners and learners within schools and settings. There is no expectation or requirement for you as schools to share those externally for any accountability purposes. I think that's something that's still taken a long time to really sink in, to accept. And of course, that then is